All right. I always got to do a little bit of an intro. I'm trying to promote my YouTube brand here. Hello, everyone. Hello, all y'all watching. All y'all ready to learn a little bit about public speaking? Well, today we're covering Chapter 13, which covers the basics of argumentation, one of my favorite subjects to teach. Before we even get started with how to persuade an audience, with how to actually construct a persuasive speech, we first have to break it down to the basic elements of how do you construct an argument, how do you provide evidence to back up claims that a skeptical audience can then evaluate and determine if your claim is true or not. This chapter goes through those basics, and then it's going to address a lot of common logical fallacies, seemingly good arguments you can put forward, but that always contain a critical flaw. It's important that we learn logical fallacies because by identifying them, we're so much less likely to use them in our speeches themselves. So, don't worry about it, Rodrigo. Again, you're free to stop whenever. So, on that note, let's go ahead and let's get started. So, I told you that Chapter 13 deals with the basics of argumentation. That means, before we even get started, we want to define an argument. An argument, at its core, presents a claim, then provides support for that claim with reasoning. I told you on Monday that the process of skepticism is the means by which you evaluate the reasoning and evidence of a claim. Because without reasoning, without evidence, you can't have reasoning. Without reasoning, you can't support a claim. And if your claim is unsupported, then you don't have an argument. Reasoning is the thought process by which you draw a conclusion from proposed evidence. Evidence is all the background data designed to help support a claim. Those could be statistics, those could be expert testimonies, those could be credible sources, those could be facts that are already independently verified. Because the process goes that I provide evidence to support a claim. From that evidence, you draw reasoning that then substantiates the claim. So, if we were to use the syllogism, the basic argument structure, we begin first with a claim or a premise, right? This was a claim. This was this basic syllogism that the Greek philosopher Socrates put forward. We begin with our claim, and we say, all men are mortal. We then follow with another claim. Socrates is a man. Our two claims by themselves are unsubstantiated. They're not necessarily true. They're not self-provingly true. Because this final claim, therefore Socrates is mortal, is supported by these two. Independently, well, wait, I misspoke. A and B are true. They are independently verified facts, as we saw here with evidence. Evidence can take the form of a verifiable fact. So, if I want to put forward my conclusion that Socrates is immortal, my evidence is that all men are mortal, that Socrates is a man, and then from that evidence, you pull forward the reasoning that because all men are mortal, and because Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. If the conclusion does not logically follow from the first two premises, then the conclusion is not valid. If must always lead to then, and so forth, okay? So, that kind of jumps ahead a little bit to fallacy, but it's the basic process by which you engage in skepticism. I told you that, actually, real quick, because I think I might be leaving out some slides. Let me pause the recording so it looks like I'm giving a flawless lecture. Here I am again, flawlessly delivering this lecture. Because now that we've broken down the basic elements of an argument, now that we've talked about the syllogism, now we're going to talk about the three categories and actually assessing evidence and reasoning. I told you on Monday that skepticism is the process by which you evaluate a claim's evidence. These are three general criteria that you're actually going to be weighing that evidence towards. If the evidence doesn't satisfy all three of these criteria to a satisfactory degree, then you, as a skeptical audience, should reject the claim as not necessarily being true. As a speaker, you should always try to evaluate your claim and the evidence for those claims along these three criteria. Of course, the first person who should be engaged in skeptically evaluating an argument is your own. You should always be trying to disprove your own argument, seeing what are the holes there. Because by identifying the holes in that argument, you can modify it, create a stronger argument, and then present it to the audience. So the three general criteria are credibility, relevance, and sufficiency. The first is credibility. Now, along this criteria, what you want to be assessing is you want to be referring back to the believability. Wait, did I mix these up? Yeah, no, I didn't. Did I? No, I didn't. Okay, yeah. Why am I so in my own head today? But credibility refers to the actual believability of the evidence. How likely is it that this could actually happen? Not only that, but who's saying this? Is there an actual agenda taking place? So, if, for example, a toothpaste company is telling you that their toothpaste is the #1 recommended brand among all dentists, you have to assess the credibility of that claim. First, how believable is it that this toothpaste company interviewed every dentist in the country and they all came up with that one particular brand as the #1 toothpaste? Second, is it actually believable? Is there not an element of bias there? The toothpaste company wants to sell you their product, so they will say things to try to convince you to buy their product. Is it consistent as well? Consistency is essentially the same thing being said across multiple sources and multiple different parties. So if this company, let's say Crest toothpaste, says they're the #1 brand, then, I'm trying to think of another toothpaste brand, then does Colgate also admit that yes, Crest beat us, they're #1, we have to admit it, we have to come forward, Crest is the #1 toothpaste, but you should still buy Colgate. If there's an inconsistency there, then that weakens the credibility of the argument. You can't have 8 different toothpaste brands all say they're #1. And lastly is accuracy. Accuracy is if they're actually hitting the target of what they want to be talking about. By being accurate, that also means that you're consistently saying, again, accuracy is consistency. They're largely interchangeable. I don't know, I'm being really awkward today. The next criteria to evaluate is relevance. Now, relevance is if the evidence actually directly applies to the claim. We'll talk a little bit about what that sounds like when evidence isn't necessarily relevant, such as with the red herring and the ad hominem fallacies. But relevance is simply demonstrating that, yes, this is connected to this. That this claim is supported by this evidence, and here's the connection, right? So, if I want to back up the claim of saying that housing cost is very high in San Diego, or more accurately, that rent in San Diego is unusually high compared to other cities in the United States, and I provide the evidence that if I say something along the lines of, we pay too much rent in San Diego. As you can see on this graph, rent prices on average in San Diego are 45% higher than the average rent cost in the rest of the United States. I'm just kind of pulling that out of my butt. But the relevance there is that I've now demonstrated to you that if I'm talking about higher rent, I'm providing evidence that there is higher rent. If you're not able to connect those two, if you're not able to demonstrate why the evidence actually applies to the claim, then the audience has no reason to regard it. I'm going to be providing I'm going to be giving a couple of examples later on in this lecture of what it sounds like when your evidence is not relevant. And next is sufficiency. The final criteria that a skeptical audience, you included, should be evaluating when hearing the reasoning or evidence for a claim is how sufficient the evidence is actually provided. What that means is that you're not just providing one particular example, that you're not just giving one statistic, one study. An argument needs to have multiple examples. It needs to have strong supporting evidence that comes from many different places. Because if you just say that one person who says this one thing, therefore it must be true, then that kind of leads to a lot of misconceptions. Think of, for example, Facebook. Now, Facebook right now is notorious for spreading misinformation. I guess Facebook's a good example, but a more accurate example would be, take, for example, the anti-vaccination movement. Now, the anti-vaccination movement has one notable piece of evidence for why vaccines cause autism. There was one study committed by one person about 20 or 30 years ago that showed that there might have been a link between a particular vaccine and increased incidence in autism. Now anti-vax people only ever provide that one example, that one piece of evidence. That is not sufficient to back up their claim. That is why it is fair to dismiss their claim as inaccurate, because not only can they not find more than one piece of actually credible, relevant evidence, but there is so much evidence disproving their claim that vaccines cause autism. So, when you're making claims in your persuasive speeches, don't just rely on one source. Don't just say, I gave this one citation, therefore you should take this claim as fact. That's why you want to be backing your claims up. That's why you want to use as many research sources as possible. And now that we've talked about the three general criteria of evaluating an argument, now we're going to talk about watching out for logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are basically fancy Latin words or weird names for identifying common bad arguments that on their surface sound like they're true, sound like they're correct, but are always intentionally misleading, or maybe not intentionally, but are misleading to an audience. It causes them to accept an invalid argument as true. The reason they're fallacies is because they always have some critical flaw that on the surface might make it sound like they're proving themselves, but lack one of those three criteria of credibility, relevance, or sufficiency. So, the first logical fallacy we want to talk about today is the ad hominem. It's probably the most common logical fallacy we hear today. Ad hominem, Latin for to the person, is when, in an argument, a person attacks the other person's character rather than actually addressing what's wrong with their argument. So what that means is that, say you're having an argument with your family about politics at the dinner table. Again, I'm sure you're all looking forward to that, but let's say that I sit down to have a dinner with my family and the subject of politics comes up, and we're debating. And I'm debating with my family about who should win the presidential election, about what should we do about universal basic income, about healthcare, about homelessness, about all these different subjects. And it gets heated. And at a certain point, my brother says something, my brother proposes a claim, and what I say is, what are you talking about? You failed out of 4th grade English. Why are you even bringing this up? Why am I even arguing with you? The reason it's an ad hominem is that on its surface, it sounds like I'm making a valid argument. I'm 4th grade English. You failed out of 10th grade English. Why are you even bringing this up to me? On the surface, it sounds like I'm making a good argument. I'm trying to say, hey, you don't know what you're talking about. But that doesn't actually address my brother's argument. That doesn't actually make it clear why I'm more right than he is. Because just because he failed out of a class 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years ago doesn't mean that he couldn't have done his research, and that doesn't mean that his claim isn't true. You hear ad hominems a lot these days. You hear them a lot, particularly in politics, where during a presidential debate or during any kind of debate, really, even during the Democratic primaries that occurred a few months ago, you would see other participants, you would see people in a debate not really addressing the other person's character, but just saying, well, here's what they did 10 years ago, and here's what they're doing now, and here's what they want to do to you. So always avoid the ad hominem. Always avoid trying to just insult the other person in the hopes of diminishing their credibility, because it kind of lowers the bar on all debate, and it doesn't actually prove you right. It's not actually having you win the argument, it's just trying to tear the other person down. Examples of ad hominems, of course, you might have heard these, of Little Mark Rubio, Crooked Hillary, Lying Ted, Fake News CNN, Fake Tears, Chuck Schumer, Sleepy Joe, and so on. None of which actually address these persons' arguments, but are there just to try to attack their personal character in the hopes of making them sound a little bit less credible to the audience. The next type of logical fallacy is the either-or fallacy. Now, the either-or, or the black and white fallacy, tries to condense and simplify a complex issue into two binary choices. Usually, it's you're either with me or you're against me. The either-or fallacy completely ignores the middle ground, the idea of compromise. Either you do this, or obviously you want to do this, right? Obviously, you are a Republican if you believe this, right? Obviously, you're a Republican if you believe in lowering taxes. So either you also believe that abortion should be legal, or you're not a Republican. That's just one example in which people try to force you into a box, into saying you're either on my side or you're not on my side. Either you're for this or you're against this. I don't know why I keep just repeating it over and over again. So, on its surface, it might sound logical. On its surface, you might say something along the lines of, well, if you believe abortion should be legal, then you believe we should kill babies. It's either this or that, right? I mean, if you believe abortion should be legal, which kills babies, then clearly you believe in killing babies. So it's either we legalize abortion or we don't kill babies. That's a fallacy, because the actual mechanics of abortion themselves aren't even that clear cut. I'm getting like super political right now, but basically, not even the mechanics of if it's actually a baby is clear cut. But not only that, it's not just about it's not just about some gleeful satisfaction of I enjoy killing babies. It's about respecting someone's choice. And so there are compromises that can occur in place. There's a middle ground that can be put in. And so by doing so, by trying to broaden it, by trying to find that compromise, you too can enhance your persuasive speeches, because you're proposing solutions that are designed to overcome and address causes or barriers that are stopping you from solving this problem. The either-or fallacy would say either we do all of it or we do none of it. But the reality is that very rarely will a solution like that ever actually be implemented. Your solution needs to try to overcome causes or barriers. Your solution actually needs to try to find that middle ground, and in doing so, actually create a workable solution that the audience can actually see happening. So some examples, of course, is either we ban all assault rifles or we will experience another mass shooting. That's an either-or fallacy. It's saying that if we don't get rid of all of these guns today, then we will have another mass shooting. Now, that's probably true, that there probably will be another mass shooting with an assault rifle or other firearm. But the reality is that, again, there are compromises to be had. There is a middle ground beyond just banning all guns. Contrast that with the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Either-or fallacy. It's saying the only solution to a mass shooting is a gun itself. There are other things to do. There are more proactive steps to take. In doing so, you now open the debate up less into either you are pro or anti-gun, and more into here's what we can do about mass shootings. Here's what we can do about guns. The next fallacy we're going to be talking about today is the slippery slope fallacy. The slippery slope takes what's called a chain of causation. It's saying that one event will cause another, will cause another, will cause another. Now, ordinarily, this is the most basic form of argument. The if-then. If you do this, then this will happen. But the slippery slope goes a step further. The slippery slope posits that if you do this thing, it will inevitably set off, or could potentially set off, an unstoppable chain of events that will lead to some dire event, to some dire conclusion. The most common type of slippery slope is, well, remember the gateway drug argument of marijuana? I don't know if this is still an argument being put forward. It probably is, probably will always be, but a common argument for why marijuana should not have been legalized, or an argument back then for why we should not have legalized marijuana, is that marijuana is a gateway drug. That while it might not be harmful in and of itself, or as harmful in and of itself, it could inevitably cause someone to then try stronger and more dangerous drugs. That if you smoke weed, then maybe you'll try cocaine. If you try cocaine, then you might get addicted to heroin. If you get addicted to heroin, then you could die as a heroin addict. And it all starts with just that one joint. Now, could that happen? Yes. But what makes it a fallacy isn't that you demonstrated that it could happen. The fallacy is that you don't demonstrate that it's likely to happen. Just because something can happen doesn't mean that it's likely to, and therefore should not be applied to everyone. Marijuana is not likely to be a gateway drug. You have not demonstrated the actual. So let's say that if trying marijuana is event A, and dying alone as a heroin addict is event Z, then you have not actually demonstrated that event A is likely to lead to event Z. You could demonstrate that event A is likely to happen to event B, which might be trying alcohol or trying cocaine, but then you need to demonstrate that event B could lead to event C. And you need to make the argument that it's likely for event C to lead to event D. And only when you've established the likelihood of each of those events being likely to lead to the next, can you finally make the claim that A could lead to Z. So that's what you want to avoid in your persuasive speeches. You want to avoid saying, if we don't do this, the planet will die. Or if we don't do this, then we could all end up out on the street. Because that slippery slope doesn't demonstrate the likelihood of it. It doesn't actually argue, okay, this could happen, therefore we should do it. It's this can happen, and based on that extreme unlikely exception, we should do this. So you should always try to demonstrate a clear line, a clear probability of event A leading to B, leading to C, leading to D. The next fallacy is the appeal to tradition. The appeal to tradition is essentially the fallacy, if it ain't broke, why fix it? Now, the appeal to tradition is because something has stood for a long time, because it was something our forebears created, because it's something that our family created, therefore it's worth keeping and worth preserving. That we are forgetting our past, or that we're committing some critical flaw. Now, the fallacy is that you haven't actually demonstrated that what's old is there, it works or is therefore better. You're simply saying that because it's been here for a long time, we should not change it. An appeal to tradition would be saying something like, we need to keep the Electoral College, which has been around since 1787. Now, the reality is that yes, we base our government on the US Constitution, but at the same time, the entire reason why the Founding Fathers allowed us the ability to create amendments to the Constitution is because they realized that times would change and our government would need to change with it. And so, to fall back on the argument that we can't change the Electoral College because it's old is a statement that the Founding Fathers themselves would disagree with. You need to demonstrate why not only this old thing is worth keeping, but why it works, why we shouldn't change things now, or at the very least, why this new change proposed is not going to be an improvement. Just falling back and saying, oh, well, we can't change things now because that's how we've always done it. That's how you keep things stagnant, and it's not actually proving a substantial claim. Next is the appeal to novelty. The complete opposite of that. The appeal to novelty is saying, well, it's brand new, therefore it must be better. This is already an outdated image because we're already past the iPhone X. I don't even know what brand of iPhone is coming up next. But the appeal to novelty is saying that, well, if it's shiny, if it's new, if it's expensive, if it's got a new number at the end of it, therefore it has to inherently be better. It's a fallacy because just because I slap a new number on the iPhone doesn't mean that it's inherently better. You have to make the argument. You have to justify to me why it's actually better. Now, granted, companies do this. They say things like, well, it's got a new camera and it's got some new feature like 3D emojis or whatever. But when people on the street can't really explain to you why they got the new iPhone, they just say, well, I needed an upgrade without really understanding what they were actually upgrading, then that's when you start getting into a fallacy territory. The next fallacy I'd like to talk about is the hasty generalization. The hasty generalization jumps to the conclusion without sufficient evidence. We talked about why you need sufficient evidence to actually prove a claim. The hasty generalization says, well, I found this one thing that proves the rule, therefore it's true for everybody. Throughout American history, military leaders have always made excellent presidents. Look at the examples of George Washington, Andrew Jackson, and Dwight Eisenhower. At the same time, though, it's making a hasty generalization because it ignores things like Andrew Jackson being kind of a big racist and kind of beating a man almost to death during a session of Congress. It's actually a thing that happened. They even made a joke about it. They called him Old Hickory because he just took his cane and beat the absolute crap out of a senator who was disagreeing with him. So we make that hasty generalization, and then we say something like, well, if we elect a general, of course he's going to be a great president. He or she is going to be a great president. You see how I just used gendered language there? We want to avoid that hasty generalization because it's a fallacy to just say, because these were all true, therefore it must be true in the future. You can't predict what happened in the past as a fair indicator of what happens in the future without sufficient evidence of actually doing so. If you make the argument for why military leaders have always made excellent presidents, and therefore why a military leader would make an excellent president, that argument holds a lot more water. But to simply say that they're excellent presidents because they're military leaders is a hasty generalization. Next, we're going to talk about false cause. Now, false cause is assuming that just because one event followed the other, that because one thing happened and then the other, that the event had to have caused the second. So by saying something like, if every single time that a football team from the AFC wins the Super Bowl, we experience economic growth, we should always root for an AFC team to win the Super Bowl so that we can have economic growth, is false cause. It's saying that just because one thing occurred prior to the next does not mean that it actually caused it. Correlation is not causation. Events just are not always related just in terms of time. And I think I've already, how many more in fallacies? Oh, I listed so many. I think we're just going to talk about this last one because I feel like I'm kind of boring your heads off going through fallacy after fallacy. But if you want to see the rest, the PowerPoint's going to be up on Canvas. And the last fallacy I'd like to talk about today is the invalid analogy. Now, the invalid analogy is where you're comparing two cases that are not necessarily alike. An analogy is where you compare two things, hoping the audience can draw some similarity. The fallacy here is that it's not actually a good analogy. So by saying something like being addicted to coffee is just as bad as being addicted to painkillers because nonetheless you're addicted, that's an invalid analogy, because the reality is that one addiction is much more severe than the other. And to just label all addiction as bad is in itself a fallacy, because we're addicted to everything. We're addicted to water. I mean, think about it. Can you think of, I mean, if I told you that I needed to take that if I needed to drink something every 3 days or else I would die, that's the definition of an addiction, no? It's a biological necessity now for us. So the invalid analogy draws a comparison between two things that aren't really comparable, or if they are comparable, then it's not really, then it's not fair to say that they're equal. So now that we talked about Chapter 13, which basically has us identify all of these fallacies, I'd like to do a little bit of a recap, and I'd like to walk us through stock issues one more time. Now, Monday, it's such a nightmare having to watch those lectures for me because I just notice all of my flaws and mistakes, but that's the nature of public speaking, I guess. So, I was jumping all over the place when I was talking about stock issues. I brought up like 8 different examples, jumping back and forth and all that. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to just take you through every element of stock issues using one consistent example, preferably taken from you so that maybe you can get a little bit of a leg up on your speech topic. And then we're going to see how it all comes together to form your persuasive speech. So, I got another PowerPoint laid out for y'all. I got so many of these you don't even know. And here I'm just going to go through a few guidelines and helpful tips that can help you when constructing your persuasive speech. So here's just the basic point breakdown. As you can see, it's a substantial portion of your final grade as both the outline and the speech. And some guidelines for a topic. I'd recommend choosing a topic that I said Monday that you should pick a topic that you're generally passionate about. That doesn't mean that it needs to be a topic that affects us on a global level. That doesn't mean that it needs to be a topic that affects all 7 billion humans, because that's a bit too abstract for the audience to really wrap their mind about. Like, we all know that climate change is a problem, but it's not knocking on each of our individual doorsteps, right? It's not something that we see in the immediate here and now. Maybe pick a topic that affects us at a bit smaller of a level. Try to think of some, not just issues that affect us in the entire United States, because that's still 360 million people, but try to pick a topic that affects us at a city level. What do you think is a problem that affects San Diego? Or if you want to open that up a little bit, what's a problem that specifically affects California? What do you think is a problem that affects your local community? So what's a problem? I live in the Mesa, so what's a problem that you think specifically affects La Mesa, just in my case, and so on. The topic can be at any level and affect any number of people. Just keep in mind that it should still be trying to challenge the audience to approach it in a new direction. We've all heard the same 6 or 7 topics over and over again. Why you should recycle, why you should quit smoking, why you should fight climate change, why you should go vegan. That's probably the most common topic I hear. But if you keep saying the same arguments that we've all heard before, then everyone's going to ignore your speech just like they've ignored all the others. And they had to have ignored it, because if you're speaking to someone who's smoking, then the reality is that I guarantee you that they've had 1 million people before tell them that they should quit smoking. So you need to try to get them to think in a new way. And I talked a little bit with Lindsay when she was in my office hours yesterday, but a good way to do that is to utilize strategic guilt, to make the audience feel a little bit guilty. Because odds are, in a lot of problems that you want to present, the audience is in some way going to be complicit, or at least not do all they can to try and fix that solution. So by making the audience feel a little bit guilty, making them feel a little bit complicit in the actual problem, then maybe you can make them uncomfortable. And by making the audience uncomfortable, you can maybe motivate them to action. Because think about it. People don't usually do things when they're comfortable with a situation. people don't usually want to go out and protest. People don't usually want to go donate. People don't want to dedicate time and energy when they're fine with the way things currently are. I mean, just think of it in terms of room temperature. Do you really want to get up and turn on the AC if you feel totally comfortable with how hot the room is right now? No. You only really get up out of your chair and turn on the air conditioning when you feel a little bit warm. So you want to try to make the audience feel a little bit uncomfortable. But making them feel guilty about the problem, then you can make them feel uncomfortable enough that they'll try to alleviate that discomfort by trying to be part of the solution. And that's just one strategy that you can get the audience thinking about the issue in a new way. Because if you make them feel like they're responsible, then it's a lot harder to ignore. So, like I talked about, you want to avoid overused topics, and you actually want to pick a topic you care about. If you're not passionate about the topic, the audience will pick up on that, guaranteed. And if you don't care about it, then why should they? I've repeated that about 1 million times on Monday. Here are just some general requirements. Just as with the informative speech, we got 6 citations and references in APA format, a minimum of 1 expert quotation, a minimum of 1 statistic, that's any numerical representation of data, any data that can be represented by a number, and the body of your speech must follow stock issues format. Just as with the informative speech, it requires a visual aid, which you can upload just like how you did with the informative speech. And the speech itself is 6 to 8 minutes long. This is all just recap from Monday. So I want to skip ahead from the introduction, and I want to just go straight into your stock issues, the 3 components of the body of your speech. Before we get started on that, I'd like to ask if you have been interested in any speech topics. Are there any potential persuasive speech topics you've been considering doing? I'd like to know, because I'd like to go through this with you, and that way it can help brainstorm a little bit for your own outline and for your own speech. This helps one of you get a little bit of a leg up. So is there any particular topic you're interested in doing? Anybody? Lindsay, you have your hand up?
I know that it talks about it with you and you already know, but fast fashion.
Fast fashion. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. Now, we already talked about that on Monday, so I'd like to hear from I'd like to try and get as many people as possible hearing, but I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, Lindsay?
Okay.
Are there any potential persuasive speech topics? Yvette?
Hi, yes, I picked up off of Lindsay's topic, and I was going to go ahead and go with Buy Black, considering that there's a lot going on with the Black Lives Matter campaign. So that was what my speech is going to be focused on, trying to persuade the audience, to spend, more money in Black entrepreneurs, Black providers, and things like that.
Okay, so hold on to that. Excellent topic, Yvette. First of all,
Thanks.
is it Yvette or Yvette? I feel like I mispronounce it every other time.
No, you're fine. It's Yvette. Thank you.
All right, well, let me ask you a few questions then, Yvette. We're on our first body paragraph, harms. What's the problem?
Well, the problem is it's kind of obvious that we're not being supported as we should amongst, Black people as well as other nationalities. Those dollars are not being spent well and they're not being supported.
How do you think you can demonstrate that to the audience?
Well, doing a little bit of research, I can kind of show how, like Black businesses, how they don't succeed and how they don't, they're not successful. And I can kind of show reasons why they're not successful. And it's because, number one, they're not being advertised to spend, you know what I mean? They're like small companies. They're not advertised like big companies where you were like, hey, I would like to go ahead and, shop there. They have nice things. If you don't know about them, then you don't shop. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And you can back that up with, again, comparative statistics. And you can show, all right, so here's how much money is spent advertising a company that is not Black owned or something along those lines compared to other Black businesses. And by illustrating that discrepancy, showing that yes, one is clearly more advertised to, has much more exposure than the other, you already show that there is an inequality there, right? And that's
Correct.
just through demonstrating statistics. Now, how else do you think you could demonstrate this, why this is a problem to the audience? That's a great way to appeal to the audience's logic. We're going to talk a little bit about that next week. We'll talk about ethos, pathos, logos. But what do you think is another strategy you could use to help demonstrate why this is a problem?
Well, because we're not taken serious. Is that like another demonstration to kind of show how,
And how would you present that to the audience?
I'm thinking, Professor. I didn't think we were going to get into this, but I'm writing everything down as you say.
Of course, it's an excellent brainstorm. Well,
but I guess I can just kind of show how, we're not taking, like I said, we're not taken serious. I have to kind of do some more research and think a little further into that too, as, how we're not taken serious, because we're being killed daily on a regular basis, just for the color of our skin. So if the government, I shall say, is doing this to us, how is America supposed to take us serious?
Now, I propose that a good way to actually bring that forward is to use those individual narratives and stories to try to establish an emotional connection to the topic. I'm just kind of reading off the slide now, sorry. But basically, now you're trying to convey a point, right? And
yes.
Some of your audience won't have that direct experience. They're not members of the Black community.
Correct.
A good way to actually try and bring that forward is to tell those individual stories. Just by telling the individual story of what it's like trying to run a business in the United States when you're not white is in itself powerful enough to try to resonate with the audience, to try to talk about the struggles, the hardships, the obstacles to overcome. And by just talking about those individual narratives, those individual stories, you can begin to provide a personal context to the issue. Now someone doesn't just need to, now you don't just need to rely on numbers and statistics to try to get the audience to care. You can have them actually empathize with the individuals who have to try to make it in this country against unequal opportunities.
Okay, so
unequal. Why am I in my head about that? But yeah, okay.
So really quick, I just jot down everything you said. Basically, I want to tell a story about how hard it is to run a business, being non-African American, when you are not Black, and that's going to be part of the body of the conversation. And my focus on that is to make a personal connection with my audience to the text that I'm discussing, and that's basically about equality.
Okay, so I apologize because it sounds like I threw way too much at you there. But basically what I'm saying is that you don't need to do all of that. You just need, the main goal of the harm section of your speech is that you just have to demonstrate why this is a problem, right?
Okay.
Why we need to support Black businesses right now. To do so, you can use narrative to try to get the audience to actually care about the issue, to form an emotional connection with it, right?
Okay.
So you don't have to use all of these, but all of these are effective strategies that combined can come together to try to get the audience to understand that, yes, this is a problem, right?
Got it.
And then we're gonna keep going a little bit, because now I'm gonna keep rolling with your example, Yvette. Now we're at the causes barriers. Now a little bit ago you were talking about the reasons why, for example, Black businesses need to be supported, or why we need to show our support for them, right? Here you could then talk about the causes for why there could be this inequality, and some of the reasons that might stop us from addressing this inequality. What's just stopping that common argument? I mean, you hear that BS argument of like the American dream, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just keep working and working hard. And if it didn't work out, then you didn't work hard enough, right?
Yes.
But in this paragraph, or in this section of your speech, you then talk about all the reasons that's currently stopping the solution from taking place. What's currently keeping this inequality going, and what's stopping it from being reduced. I'm just kind of repeating myself at this point, but so, and you can both mention causes or barriers, but what do you think are some causes of this issue, Yvette?
some causes of this issue. Well, like I mentioned before, like we're not, well, and again, we did talk about that. We're not advertised, you know, we're not equally advertised. We're not equally respected. And then we're just basically not given the opportunity to, you know, advance, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So
Okay.
hold on to those causes. And what do you think are some barriers currently stopping? What do you think are some barriers current? Because again, I'm sure that if you asked, I'm sure it's very rare that if you ask someone on the street, if you just pulled them up, or, well, I hope it's rare, but it's very rare that if you pulled someone off the street and they said, do you support Black businesses? It's very rare that they would say no, right? And yet the inequality persists. As you said, this is an issue. So what do you think are some barriers stopping this what do you think are some barriers stopping us from reducing this inequality? What do you think would be the counter argument here?
I guess I'm not quite understanding the question. I know you're saying like, what are the barriers? Like, what is stopping us from being unequal? Is that what I'm hearing?
It's more like what's stopping us from, it's more like what's stopping us from being equal. So like, let's say this, right? Because
Okay.
your solution is going to be, we need to support Black businesses.
Okay.
What do you think could be some barriers stopping people from supporting Black businesses?
Some barriers that are stopping us from supporting the Black businesses.
Some reasons someone would give to not support Black businesses. Now,
Prejudice?
could be, right? That's of course going to be a major factor. And now the reason you want to address these barriers is because then, and I'm just going to skip a little bit ahead, is that in the third section of your speech, you're going to be proposing your solution. Now, the entire point of this section of your speech, your causes barriers, is that you're creating the counter argument. And then in your solution, you're knocking down the counter argument. I always do that gesture when I say knock down. But what you're doing is you're saying, okay, so here are all the reasons why someone would give for why my solution couldn't work. And now, in my solution, I'm going to tell you why all those reasons aren't valid. Here's how we overcome those causes barriers. So your solution is, okay, we're going to support Black businesses. But remember that one of your causes was that there's a disparity of advertising. How do you think your solution could help address that cause? How do you think it could overcome
Advertising.
that?
By advertising.
And how do you think we, the audience in particular, could help do that?
By what? Well, how can the audience help us advertise more?
Exactly, right? How do you think they could do that?
We can request it, or maybe demand it, or ask for it. No?
Of course we can demand it, right? First, we can write to any company. We're in a consumer, we are the consumer, right? Companies want to keep us happy more than anything. So if we write to them and say, hey, you know what? You need to advertise more of this particular business, then they're going to sit up and listen, especially if we get more and more people to write to them. And not only that, we live in an age of social media. We live in an age where it's easier than ever to advertise any kind of particular brand. All it takes is for us to just spread the message, share the word, and share the brand. So it's not just, so we can support businesses not only through buying their products, but through also trying to get as many other people as possible to also buy their products, to spread the word, to share the brand. If other companies won't pay to advertise these businesses, then we, the people, can do that ourselves. Does that make sense?
It does.
And that's just one way that you can help the individual of the audience get involved with the solution in a way that actually addresses the counter argument.
Okay.
So you want to do two things with your, well, you want to do more than two things, but you have two general goals with your solution. You want to demonstrate why your solution would actually alleviate some of the harms you listed, some of the reasons why this is a problem, and then how your solution overcomes some of the reasons that might stop you from implementing the solution. Does that make sense?
It does. I just want to be clear. In my solution, I want to focus on why we want to live, excuse me, why we want to alleviate the harm. And then number two is going to be how to alleviate, excuse me, how to overcome.
It's more how to alleviate and how to overcome.
Got it. So
because
how
the why you'd want to alleviate, that was your first main point. That's the harm. That's why this is an issue, right?
Okay, so sorry, I'm all over my little cheat sheet here that I'm writing on. I am going to have to listen to this again later on tonight.
No worries.
But I just want to be clear on the solution. So we want to overcome the solution, and then we want to alleviate the solution. I'm sorry. Let me say this again.
No worries. I've been all over the place too. It's my fault more than anything. So let me just.
The solution is I want to overcome it and I want to alleviate it.
Let me just take it from the top, okay?
Sorry.
No worries. Again, it's my fault. So we're starting with our harms. Why this is a problem. We're giving reasons why this is a problem, right? Then we're giving causes, barriers, reasons what's currently stopping us from solving this problem. Because if we're saying this is a huge problem, then we have to say, why is nothing being done about it? And then in your solution is how you solve the problem in a way that addresses the causes or barriers you listed. Does that make sense?
Yep, I got this one now. It's clear on this note.
There you go.
Solve the problem. Yes, thank you.
There you go. So, again, sorry that I'm being so confusing and all over the place.
No, you're fine.
And then, as you're in your solution, you want to propose an action step. Now, that action step is what the individual listening to this speech can do today that would help make the solution a reality. So you're not just speaking to some abstract audience. You're speaking to me. You're speaking to your classmates. You're speaking to anyone currently watching your speech. You do want to keep in mind, though, that we don't have unlimited time, money. A lot of us can't even really leave the house right now.
Right.
So we have to keep that in mind when proposing it in a way that what's something that everyone can do, everyone, regardless of where they're at, where they are, who they're with, how much money they have, that would help make them a part of the solution. It doesn't need to completely solve the problem, just enough to give them that first step, an easy first step that they can do. Now, what you can do, Yvette, is for an action step, what do you think would be a good action step? I don't want to speak for you there. What do you think would be a good action step?
Well, like I mentioned before, when I said that we can start supporting, we can start advertising more, and then we can start demanding that, nationally we advertise as well, or nationally we support versus, like you said, we spread the word, social media, we can demand, hey, more advertisement. Is that what we're looking for?
Exactly, but you want to get specific here. How? What do you want me to do specifically?
Spread the word.
How?
Advertise, spread the word, tell a friend, social media.
But that's the thing, right? You want to be as specific as possible in terms of specific actions, right? Saying something as just saying, go on Twitter, type it, and share this hashtag, right? Normally, I'm not a huge fan of social media solutions. Normally, I think that's just kind of raising awareness, but I think it applies to your particular topic, especially when advertising brands, right? But with that action step, you want to be specific and you want to say, I want you to go to this website and I want you to type this and I want you to do this today, right? Because the more vague you are, the less likely someone is to actually follow through with it. I think to just say spread the word, then yeah, they might tell a friend about it, but that might not be enough. Or they might even forget about it as soon as they're done listening to the speech. The more specific the action step, the more legwork you do, the easier it is for the audience to follow through, and the more they feel like they're actually taking part in that solution. Does that make sense?
It does. So my action point here would be relating to advertising. I want them to log on to this particular website and to express their feelings or, support. That would be something kind of like a direct action.
Exactly. Direct action. Okay. That's the perfect way to describe it, right?
Got it.
The more direct the action, the more the audience feels like they're directly taking part in the solution.
Got it.
Okay. So,
Okay.
so do you have any questions, Yvette?
I'm sure I do, but I'm not going to waste everybody else's time.
No, don't worry about it. Again, it's the whole point, right? So, I really like how we took that. I'd like to just go one more time with another speech topic. Lindsay, would you like to do fast fashion?
Yeah, that's fine, as long as no one else wants to go ahead and have an idea.
Okay. Does anyone else have any ideas they'd like to share? Any ideas they'd like to go through with this? Stock issues? Okay, well, on that note, let's go through fast fashion, okay, Lindsay? Now,
Okay.
let's start at the beginning, right? The harms. Why is fast fashion a problem?
A lot of it is like the synthetic dyes that are used in it and the effects they have and like how they pollute water. There's a lot, and then there's like sweatshops that are used, and that affects the workers that are working. Like the work conditions for them are not good at all. So there's that, the synthetic dyes, like how much water it uses to make a t-shirt is ridiculous. Those are just like some of the ideas I have.
Okay, so fast fashion, which is companies using cheap outsourced labor to make cheap clothes, it hurts the environment, it pollutes, and it exploits people for labor, right? It makes them work in horrible working conditions for incredibly low amounts of pay, especially compared to how much the product is actually sold for, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we could provide statistics for that, right? But what other strategies do you think we could use to try to get the audience to really see how bad of a problem this is? Why fast fashion needs to be stopped?
I have to think about that.
Well, remember what we talked about with Yvette. You can use narrative, right? Now, most of us know that a lot of our clothes probably came from a sweatshop, but most of us have never worked in a sweatshop. We don't know what that's like. So it's very distant for us. We say something like, "Yeah, I know it's bad, but I feel sorry for them." A good way to get the audience to actually understand how big of an issue this is to show them a first-hand experience of what it's like to work in a sweatshop. That's where you can use narrative. You can either use a hypothetical example or a real example to take the audience through a day of what someone has to go through and how much they're paid at the end of a full shift at a sweatshop. Okay?
Yeah.
By doing so, you again create that emotional tone. You help the audience actually connect to someone, and that's what you want to aim for, that empathy. You want them to feel bad, not just for buying this shirt, but that you want them to feel bad for buying something that came at the expense of somebody else. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can I tell a story? Like, I don't know if you remember or ever heard about the building that collapsed in Bangladesh that was fast fashion. Could I
Absolutely,
tell
I've
a
heard about
story?
that. Yeah. And that's a very effective story, right? Those are people literally crushed to death because because they were under such horrible working conditions that the building just gave out around them, right?
Yeah.
And that's a great way to, and I doubt most people in your audience, I've only heard about it because I've heard speeches on this before, but I doubt that most of your audience will have even heard about it, right?
Yeah.
So you demonstrate the human cost of this issue. And I think that would be a great story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now we're going to move on to causes or barriers. So, why do you think fast fashion exists, Lindsay? What do you think are some causes behind that?
I think because a lot of people are really into fashion and they need a cheap, affordable way to get it because a lot of people don't have a lot of money. They're paying like they're living rent to rent, but they need clothes to wear. And so I don't think it will ever fully go away because people will keep purchasing from these businesses because they're so cheap and affordable and they're making like items that are on trend.
Exactly, right? Fashion is a big deal. It's a huge industry. And at the same time, people don't like to drop $90 for a t-shirt, right? Or if they do, they
Yeah.
like that to, I mean, I don't know. But The reality is that people don't like paying money for things that they need, and everyone needs clothes, and everyone wants to look good. So it's the perfect compromise to find ways to look good that don't bankrupt you, right?
Yeah.
So if that's going to be the general cause, if that's both the general cause and the greatest barrier towards solving it, because it's the reason it exists is because people want cheap clothes. The reason it'll stay is because no one wants to pay more for their cheap clothes, right? So, what do you think is what would be a proposed solution for fast fashion that would address that cause or barrier, Lindsay?
Some solutions that I think everyone could do, because it's a much bigger problem and you can't just tackle it so easily. But I think some things we could do are thrift stores. There's a lot of apps like Poshmark and Mercari that are resell clothing apps. So you can purchase from those while you're also supporting small businesses. And like Yvette was saying, a lot of those would be like Black owned businesses. So you purchase from those people rather than purchasing from like Forever 21 or H&M.
Yeah, like the big brands don't need your help, right?
Yeah.
Like they don't need your support, even though every multi-billion-dollar company right now seems to be showing a bunch of ads about how much they need my money, but whatever. So I completely agree. And I really like that solution, Lindsay, because you're not just saying don't support fast fashion. You're showing me how to not support fast fashion. You're teaching me what are some brands I can support, what are some resources I can use that would have me use that would help me buy ethically conscious clothing that still respects my budget, right?
Yeah.
And by teaching the audience how to do that, now it's less about convincing them and it's more just about, okay, just do that first step. I'm saying this because I think I hear every semester about a dozen speeches on why you should go vegan, right? And I'm just using this as a little bit of an example. And I hear these speeches, and the solution is always go vegan. Cut meat out of your diet. If you don't cut meat out of your diet, you're murdering animals. Now's the time that you have to make that change. Now, they're not wrong, but at the same time, going vegan isn't something you can do overnight. It requires a huge amount of research, of preparation. You have to understand your diet. You have to understand your dietary needs. You have to make suitable plant substitutes for everything you're eating. It's not something you can just do overnight, or that at least you shouldn't do overnight. So most people will see that huge choice in front of them and they'll say, that sounds hard and I don't want to do research on my own, so I won't. But by showing the audience how to go vegan, by showing, okay, here's how you can get started. You just cut meat out of one day out of your week. And here's some places you can eat that serve really great vegan food. By doing that, now the audience can see, okay, I can make that transition. It's something that looks really easy to do, because if you break it down into a series of steps, all I have to do is just follow one step to the next. So for that huge tangent, I like your solution, Lindsay, because now it's just as simple as downloading an app, as putting into my phone, because I'm awful with directions, the location of the nearest thrift store. And by doing all of that, now it feels like I really can be a part of the solution. I don't just have to force myself to keep supporting the fast fashion industry. And then, so you're giving us all these steps, Lindsay. What do you think would then be the first step to all of that, to getting started with everything you're describing? What do you think would be an effective action step?
Like you said, just as far as even much as just downloading an app. And maybe if there's a staple you're looking for, like I don't know, a white T-shirt, instead of going to Forever 21 or H&M, download Pop something and search white T-shirt, and there will be hundreds of people selling them.
Exactly. An app is something that takes 5 minutes out of my day, and it's something that's always going to be on my phone screen. Well, I don't know how many apps people usually have on their phone, but I have like 5. But downloading an app takes no time at all. It's a visual reminder of what I can do, and it's to my benefit. It's something that can help me. I like having more money in my pocket, right? So it just seems like a win-win for everybody, because at the same time, you're not paying an excessive amount, and you're still being ethically conscious. So those are all very effective elements towards creating a speech on why you should limit fast fashion. Do you have any questions for me there, Lindsay?
Nope, no questions. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for indulging me with those two examples. Again, excellent speech topics. Before we head out today, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just going to stop the recording again. Bye, y'all.